Ladies and gentlemen, there comes a moment in history when everything you thought you understood shatters, when alliances built on trust, on strategy, on sacrifice begin to crack, not because of armies, not because of treaties, but because of one man's decision, one Indian. Ladies and gentlemen, the relationship between nations is rarely shaped by just governments or treaties. Often it is the actions of a single person that can shift the entire balance of power. When it comes to U.S.-India relations, a deep partnership built on shared democratic values, economic cooperation, and strategic interests, it was not a war or a political collapse that threatened its integrity, but the decision of one individual. This person, though not wielding an army or a nation's might, held enough influence, authority, or visibility to redirect the trajectory of years of diplomacy. Their move was not accidental. It was deliberate, timed, and impactful. It sent ripples through embassies, ministries, and intelligence rooms. And while the press tried to decode the motive, and analysts scrambled to assess the fallout, the damage had already been done. When such an act comes from within, from someone who carries the weight of national identity or representation, the betrayal is felt deeper. It's not about opposing ideologies, it's about breaking trust. Trust that was forged through shared struggles, through common threats, through aspirations that both India and the United States had envisioned together. This disruption wasn't a mere policy disagreement or a diplomatic misstep. It was a direct hit to the foundation of friendship between two nations that stood together on global platforms advocating for freedom, security, and cooperation. The individual's influence, whether political, bureaucratic, or intellectual, was enough to challenge this alliance, and in doing so, they became the epicenter of a storm that no one saw coming. The world didn't react because they were surprised something happened. The world reacted because of who caused it. It exposed the fragility of even the strongest alliances. It reminded everyone that while treaties are signed in ink, they are kept alive by integrity. When one person abuses that integrity, when they weaponize access, trust, or public influence, they don't just make a statement, they alter the course of international relations. Leaders in Washington and New Delhi had spent decades fostering a bond based on more than convenience. It was about vision, yet one act by a single Indian individual managed to cast shadows of suspicion over that vision. It led to a period of reassessment, caution, and pause. It changed the tone of conversations behind closed doors. Suddenly, what was once certain became questionable. What was warm became cold, and all of it stemmed not from armies or economic crashes, but from the power of one who chose personal ambition, hidden agendas, or ideological allegiance over collective progress. That one individual didn't just disrupt a bilateral relationship. They showed the world that even the strongest bridges can burn from within. Ladies and gentlemen, in the complex theater of global politics, silence is often the preferred language. Diplomats speak in carefully measured words, statements are sanitized, and conflicts are often swept under the carpet in the name of maintaining alliances. But not everyone follows that script. When Donald J. Trump took the stage and publicly called out the sabotage of U.S.-India relations, it wasn't just a political move, it was a disruption of the status quo. He didn't hide behind protocol, nor did he choose to whisper his concerns behind closed doors. He chose the global stage, the full glare of media, and the weight of his influence to say what others were too hesitant to admit. That the strong, evolving relationship between two of the world's largest democracies had been undermined, not by global conflict or opposing ideologies, but by the calculated actions of a single individual. Trump's decision to speak up was more than a commentary, it was a declaration. In his trademark directness, he peeled away the diplomatic layers and called the act what it truly was: sabotage. And when someone with his global platform says it aloud, it forces the world to stop, to listen, and to question what they might have ignored or chosen not to see. His words sent a message to every government official, strategist, and journalist watching, that this wasn't business as usual. This was betrayal cloaked in policy. His voice acted as a spotlight, turning what might have remained an internal issue into an international concern. It wasn't just that someone had disrupted the relationship, it was that Trump believed it had been done with intent and with consequences that were too serious to be brushed aside. His public statement altered the nature of the discussion. Suddenly, questions began to emerge. Who was responsible? What were their motives? Why had this act gone unaddressed until now? Trump, love him or hate him, has never been one to play by the rules of quiet diplomacy. His choice to address the matter openly did more than just stir controversy. It broke the silence that had protected the saboteur. In doing so, he opened a floodgate of accountability. Governments were now being asked for answers. Media outlets dove deeper. Think tanks reevaluated their assumptions, and the global public, particularly those invested in the US-India relationship, were awakened to a reality that had been buried beneath the surface. Trump's revelation wasn't just a political bombshell. It was a reminder that truth, even when inconvenient, demands to be spoken. It shifted the narrative from suspicion to confirmation. It proved that someone at the top had noticed and, more importantly, had chosen not to stay silent. In international affairs, where ambiguity often reigns supreme, Trump's directness was jarring, but it was also necessary, because when relationships are sabotaged from within, silence only feeds the damage. Speaking out, especially from a position of power, doesn't just expose the truth, it forces the world to confront it. Ladies and gentlemen, in the world of international diplomacy, not all disruptions are born from chaos or confusion. Some are carefully orchestrated, precise in their intent, and deliberate in their execution. What happened to US-India relations was not the result of a misunderstanding, a misstep, or a communication breakdown. It was a betrayal, one that was planned, calculated, and knowingly carried out by someone who understood exactly what they were doing. This was not the spontaneous fallout of political disagreement. It was a choice executed with clarity and purpose by an individual who knew the stakes, understood the consequences, and still went forward. That is what makes this moment so critical, because it wasn't the act of someone unaware of the importance of the alliance. It was someone who knew its value and chose to undermine it anyway. That's not recklessness, that's betrayal. This betrayal didn't come through a dramatic announcement or a violent declaration. It came in quiet moves, carefully timed statements, intentional alignments, backdoor conversations, and public gestures that signaled division rather than unity. Every step was subtle enough to be defended as strategy, but impactful enough to be recognized as sabotage by those paying attention. It wasn't the kind of mistake you fix with a press release or diplomatic handshake. It was too intentional for that. When someone in a position of influence knowingly disrupts a partnership that took decades to build, it's not a lapse in judgment, it's an agenda. And that agenda, whether fueled by personal gain, ideological obsession, or loyalty to forces beyond public understanding, speaks volumes. The timing of the betrayal was no coincidence either. It came at a moment when U.S.-India relations were reaching new heights. Military exercises, trade agreements, space collaborations, intelligence sharing, all were signaling a growing bond. And just as that momentum was gathering speed, a single decision unraveled years of effort. That kind of impact doesn't happen by chance. It happens when someone aims for it. It's one thing to disagree with policy. Democracies are built on disagreement. It's another thing entirely to compromise national interest, weaken strategic trust, and do so while pretending to serve the very institutions being damaged. What makes this betrayal even more dangerous is its disguise. It wore the mask of diplomacy, the tone of patriotism, and the language of reform, but underneath was a well-calculated move to shift the axis of alliance. And while the public may not have seen the full picture at first, those within the halls of power did. They saw the pieces being moved, they felt the shift in tone, the sudden pause in cooperation, the coldness in one-swarm conversations. They knew something had changed, and not for the better. This wasn't an accident caused by incompetence. It was a strike carried out by someone who knew exactly where to hit, how to hit, and when to do it. That's why it matters. Because in geopolitics, as in life, betrayal cuts deepest not when it's loud, but when it's precise. Ladies and gentlemen, in a world where nations are guided by massive institutions, complex treaties, and generations of diplomatic protocol, it is easy to believe that only entire governments or armies can shift the course of history, but the truth is far more profound and far more unsettling. Sometimes it takes just one voice to shake the foundation of even the strongest global alliances. One voice, when placed in the right position, when amplified by the right platform, and when driven by unshakable conviction or calculated intent, can do what entire institutions fear, create disruption that resonates across borders, breaks trust, and forces even the most stable partnerships to pause and reevaluate. The world has seen wars begin not just with armies, but with a single speech, a single declaration, or a single betrayal disguised as leadership. And that is where the real weight of individual power lies. In the case of U.S.-India relations, the influence of one voice became the epicenter of unexpected turbulence. It wasn't the collective will of the people, nor the agreed vision of a cabinet. It was a single person, a single decision maker who shifted the tone, twisted the narrative, and created a ripple effect that soon grew into a diplomatic tremor. That voice had power, not just because of its volume, but because of where it came from. It came from someone positioned at the crossroads of politics and perception, where a single word can be taken as doctrine, and a single action as a national stance. When that voice spoke, it wasn't merely expressing an opinion. It was shaping headlines, triggering responses from global leaders, and forcing diplomats into crisis mode. The reason such power is so dangerous is because it often operates outside the traditional checks and balances of diplomacy. Agreements signed in good faith between two nations can be undone, not formally but effectively, when one influential figure decides to speak out of turn or act out of alignment. This isn't theory. This is how international trust is lost. And when trust is lost, even the most robust alliance becomes fragile. It begins with doubt. Doubt leads to caution. Caution leads to distance. And distance, in global politics, is a silent killer. One voice, if used recklessly, can turn allies into skeptics. But this reality is not limited to destruction. The same voice, in the hands of someone with vision and courage, can also inspire revolutions, mend fractured alliances, and create global movements of hope. That is the double-edged nature of personal power. It can build or break. In this case, it broke, and it served as a powerful reminder to the world that influence is no longer just institutional. It is personal. It belongs to individuals who, by title or by charisma, have the ears of millions, and when one of them speaks with intent, whether grounded in truth or driven by ego, the world listens, nations shift, and history rewrites itself. Ladies and gentlemen, diplomacy may appear to be about documents, handshakes, and carefully crafted policy statements. But beneath all that structure lies something far more human: people. It is easy to assume that treaties alone build alliances, or that shared interests are enough to sustain partnerships. But in truth, it is the individuals behind the scenes, their values, trust, integrity, and relationships, that hold the very foundation of diplomacy together. Behind every signed agreement, every high-level meeting, and every bilateral summit, there are people making decisions, taking risks, reading the room, and navigating the emotional complexity of international trust. Policies may define the direction, but people define the journey. In the case of U.S.-India relations, the trajectory of cooperation has been influenced not just by strategy, but by the personal rapport between leaders, diplomats, military officials, and cultural ambassadors who built bridges through conversation and understanding. It was the warmth of these relationships that allowed sensitive negotiations to move forward, even during turbulent times. It was mutual respect between key individuals that made way for compromise and collaboration. And when the trust between those individuals begins to erode, even the strongest policy frameworks can start to collapse from within. That's the human truth too often hidden behind political headlines. When one person in a position of influence chooses to act outside the spirit of mutual respect and shared interest, it doesn't just create disagreement, it fractures the personal trust that holds the machinery of diplomacy together. A document cannot repair that breach. A handshake cannot erase betrayal. Only people with genuine accountability and humility can restore what was damaged. That's why diplomacy is more vulnerable and more powerful than it appears. Because it is not powered by cold logic alone. It is driven by human connection, emotional intelligence, and the courage to maintain dialogue, even in disagreement. Alliances between countries, especially ones as influential and complex as the US and India, are not just alliances between governments. They are partnerships between cultures, economies, militaries, and most importantly, individuals. When those individuals engage with sincerity, diplomacy becomes more than politics. It becomes a bridge of hope. But when those individuals pursue personal agendas or use diplomacy as a stage for ego and ambition, they put entire nations at risk. And the damage can go far beyond policy. It seeps into the perceptions of people, the tone of media, the hesitation of investors, and the decisions of future leaders. That is why it is not enough to write good policy. It is not enough to promise cooperation on paper. Those words must be lived out by people with integrity and vision. They must be backed by actions that reflect not just national interest, but mutual respect. In diplomacy, trust is currency, and just like any relationship, when the trust between people is broken, no amount of political language can cover the silence that follows. Ladies and gentlemen, in every great alliance, there comes a moment that tests its strength, its depth, and its true purpose. U.S.-India relations have faced challenges before, but this recent disruption, caused not by an enemy state, but by an insider, feels different. It strikes at the heart of trust, and it shakes the very framework of what has been built over decades. But as unsettling as it may be, this is not a moment of collapse. This is a moment of awakening. Setbacks, especially those that arrive without warning and from unexpected directions, have a way of jolting systems out of complacency. They force reflection, they expose the weak points, and more importantly, they reveal who truly stands for the alliance, not just in times of celebration, but in moments of crisis. This setback has created pause, yes. It has slowed the momentum that was carrying the partnership forward. It has raised questions in both capitals, questions about motives, loyalty, and long-term commitment. But in the light of those questions lies an opportunity to reevaluate, to rebuild stronger, and to ensure that the foundation of this alliance is no longer dependent on individuals alone, but on deeper, more resilient ties. Challenges like this don't signify the end, they signify a turning point, they strip away illusions and force clarity, they encourage both sides to step back and ask what this partnership truly means, beyond trade, beyond strategy, beyond political optics. In moments like these, leadership matters more than ever, not just political leadership, but moral leadership, the kind that refuses to let disruption define the narrative, the kind that responds not with bitterness, but with renewed purpose, the kind that sees a crack in the wall and decides not to abandon the structure, but to rebuild it stronger, brick by brick. That is the power of awakening. It changes how we see the problem and how we choose to respond to it. Both the United States and India are resilient democracies, shaped by struggle, driven by vision, and anchored in the idea that progress is never a straight line. There will always be setbacks, there will always be forces, internal and external, that attempt to divide. But what defines the future is not the setback itself. It is the decision to stand back up, to speak harder truths, and to work even more intentionally toward a common goal. This disruption, painful as it may be, has given both nations a chance to review not just their agreements, but their values, a chance to ensure that the alliance is built not on temporary convenience, but on enduring principles. It is often in the wake of betrayal that the most powerful awakenings occur, and it is in the silence that follows disruption where new voices can rise, wiser, clearer, and more determined. That is where this moment stands now, not in the darkness of defeat, but on the edge of deeper understanding, where setbacks become fuel and awakening becomes the first step forward.